Welcome to the October 2021 meeting of the Lake Bluff PCZBA. If we could have a roll call, please.
Certainly, we will return to Member Danley, Member Fisher,
Here.
Member Miller,
Here.
Member Russell,
Here.
Member Sorensen,
Here.
Member Toll,
Here.
Chair Peters.
Here. All right, and Member Danley, in accordance with the applicable ordinance with respect to remote participation, my understanding is that you've met the criteria to participate via video and/or remotely, both for discussion and any votes. I don't anticipate any votes today, but you'll be a full participant.
That's right.
Unless there is objection from anybody.
Hearing none, we'll proceed. Agenda item number 2, non-agenda items and visitors, public comment time. As the public knows, we allocate 15 minutes at the beginning of each meeting for members of the public to raise issues or questions or comments to matters that are not on the agenda. Is there anyone out there tonight, Mr. Cole?
There's no one with us here in Village Hall. I can see that there is one person joining us by Zoom, but they have not asked to be recognized.
Okay. Hearing no request to participate, we'll proceed to agenda item number 3, consideration of minutes. Both the September 22, 2021 special meeting minutes and the September 22, 2021 joint workshop meeting minutes. We'll go through each of the 2 documents separately, but we can address it by motion, by one single motion when the time comes. Any proposed revisions to the special meeting minutes from the PCZBA?
I had one quick comment on page 3. The second paragraph from the top. The words "in the CE district as," I think should be stricken, because my comment was that there should be a size limit for all the districts, a fixed size limit, not just the CE district.
Okay.
And those are the regular meeting minutes.
The regular meeting minutes.
Thank you, Member Russell. Any other proposed revisions or other changes? Hearing none, let's proceed to the draft minutes of the Joint Plan Commission and Zoning Board of Appeals with the Board of Trustees, or vice versa. Again, conducted on September 22, 2021. Any proposed changes to that document?
Just a brief question. I would assume that the village board would also approve these minutes in their meeting, or has that happened already?
That has already happened in this case.
Thank you.
All right. Hearing no proposed comments or revisions, is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Okay, motion carries. Agenda item number 4, accessory dwelling unit workshop. As the commissioners are aware, obviously we've spent a considerable amount of time over the past several months trying to work our way through that draft document through the fine efforts of Mr. Schuster and his firm and Mr. Cole and his team. We've got what we believe is a finalized document, at least finalized from the perspective of possibly being able to proceed with a public hearing in the near future. I trust that everybody's had a chance to review the current document. Are there any concerns, or is there any proposed further discussion?
I do have a couple quick comments. On page 6, section H, item number 2, prohibition in street yards. I'm wondering if we really intend to prohibit detached accessory dwellings On those streets where the back lot line abuts an alley. We have a couple alleys in the village off of East Sheridan Place primarily. So between Foss Court and Newman and Hurst. And the way this reads right now, I think because we called out public right-of-way, those alleys are public right-of-ways, we're prohibiting detached accessory dwellings in the rear yard of all of those lots, because those rear yards abut a 12-foot wide alley. And I don't think we ever talked about it, but I certainly would have no objection to those lots being able to have a detached accessory dwelling
So how would we
in
change
those
the wording?
locations, because it's actually, to me, would be a better place than where the lot lines just come together. So that if we, staff could craft just that basic, I'm sure it can be a quick fix language-wise to allow that. My suggestion.
I would agree.
That's a good
I
suggestion.
think that's a
Agree.
good find on that one, Trish.
And then I just wanted to have a question for staff, I just want to confirm, because it's still not crystal clear to me, that there's no intention to allow for any type of relaxation of any of the bulk regulations for the construction of the accessory dwelling units.
That's correct.
And then lastly, but not least, on the last, or page 9, I think we have 2 section references that were actually bad references a month ago, and they just weren't fixed yet.
So-
Page
Oh.
9,
If I may, for 1 second, before we move away from the alley comment. So just looking up the definition of alley in our zoning code, and we can exclude alley. We define it as any public way for vehicular or pedestrian travel by the public and designed and intended primarily as a means of access to and from the rear of properties. So it's, I think that it's, the way we're defining it, it's primarily as a means of access, which differs from a street, which is, you can't say it's just access, but it's also for travel. So we would just exclude it, alley, from that provision. Is that your intent with that definition?
yeah, I don't know what the final specific language would be, but I'm just thinking that we should allow it on these lots.
Right,
Where the
okay.
rear lot abuts a public right-of-way that is an alley.
Right.
And I think right now, because we use the term public right-of-way in the list, and an alley is a public right-of-way, that we
Correct.
would be prohibiting those detached accessory
So,
structures there, so.
Yeah, so what we can do is just say this shall not apply to alleys. And conversely, a street is defined as a public thoroughfare, avenue, road, highway, boulevard, parkway, way, drive, lane, or court that has been dedicated to the public, that serves as the primary roadway to and egress from property abutting its length. So we'll exempt from this provision alley.
Okay.
And then, lastly, in terms of my comments, on page 9, under the parking section, it says as provided in section 10-5-15, and that section doesn't actually exist. It's 10-10-15G.
And
Oh,
remember, Russell, it's actually up on page 4. It should be 10-5-15. So we'll flip that around. So, chapter 10 is the sign code. But we will catch that this time.
Okay, and then the same, under minimum habitable space, I think we've got the same, there's some section reference that doesn't jive with the rest of the document there.
Yeah. We'll go through and double check all references.
That's all I had.
Oh, excellent points. Thank you, Member Russell. Any other comments from the commissioners?
I just have a couple questions. The bottom of page 3, number F, the last line, or second to the last line. Why did we strike residential pool house? Can you remind me why?
Sure, so as originally written down the by right road, and there's still some discussion to have here too, you know, treating pool houses as a special use, but treating accessory dwelling units by right, I mean, those kind of conflict, right? They're incompatible. So what we proposed in that draft was to remove the residential pool house as a special use, essentially to allow those just
It'll be its own category.
to, well, they would just be able to be built.
Okay,
So
not
instead
as
of,
not as a special use. Okay,
yeah, because originally the foundation was, we don't want to allow people to make habitable space as pool houses.
right.
Then we made pool houses a special use. If you were to adopt this, there's some, you know, administrative discretion here, but essentially, if people are just building a pool house that happens to have a bathroom and light and heat,
Okay.
but you couldn't use it as a dwelling unit, we would allow those just as another accessory structure.
Okay, okay.
If that is something someone's not comfortable with, certainly we can talk about that further, but that was the
No, that
original
makes sense. I
rationale.
just didn't understand whether it should be in or out, and I know it's out on the next page, and, you know, so I just wanted to check that. On page 5, let's see, E1 and E2, do we have to do anything with sufficient? You know, sufficient is just such a subjective word. We're okay with that? I don't know a better word, but is that gonna come back and have any?
So there's two, I think, legal philosophies behind this. So if you want to define sufficient and put a definition, so to speak, to it, what you would expect, so provide sufficient distance, you must have at least 5 feet or 10 feet or whatever you think, you could do
Right.
it.
But then that'll create
But
its own
then-
set of problems.
But
Yeah.
when determining, you know, if it's sufficient, I mean, at the moment, it creates a lot of discretion in this body. So you're looking at it as a case-by-case basis, what is sufficient?
Okay,
And it's a term that we use throughout the code when we're evaluating other standards for special uses. Probably, I'd have to look back, but it probably comes up in variations as well. But the idea is, we're trying to reserve for you the ability, you know, to look fact-specific
right,
and not be so tied to, oh, it's 5 feet.
Right.
Check the box.
right.
Even if you know, we must approve it. I think depending on what is sufficient will depend on, you know, on adjacent properties. Well, how close is that property? The definition of what's sufficient space may differ depending on the size, the
Okay,
scale.
so we've got the
So
discretion
you
then,
have discretion.
essentially.
We have that because it's a special use, correct? If it goes to, you know, by right, then perhaps we would want to put in a minimum
More clarifying.
distance.
Right.
Okay, okay, makes sense. Okay, and then last, on page 7, talking about abandonment, I just was curious, 6 months seems short. You know, we seem to be flying through time, maybe that's just my perspective, but 6 months.
Depends how old you are.
To have 6 months be starting the abandonment thing just seemed kind of short to me, so, but I could be wrong.
That is wholly within your discretion to decide. It's not a number with any particular gravity for us. I think it may be used one other place in the code, I think is where we drew it
So
from.
why do we have this, just for explanation, why do we have an abandonment statute in here?
Well, so it's typical when you were dealing with a special use to have some sort of abandonment provision, because what you would not necessarily want to, like, when you're blessing it, when it comes before us and you say, this meets our standards, you're looking at it generally as a capture in time. But if somebody doesn't use it for 15 years, just pick an arbitrary number, whatever time period and then all of a sudden they want to start doing it again,
Right.
there may be issues. The property next door may have changed. The, you know, the people who moved in had no idea that had ever been used as a accessory dwelling unit, and there may be issues that you want to look at again. So our recommendation with all special uses, not just accessory dwelling units, is that if a property is not used for a particular purpose for a certain length of time, that it becomes deemed to be abandoned, you lose the special use, and then if you'd want to take it up again, you'd have to come forward and go through the process. So 6 months, you know, it's not that it's never, and I guess I look at it this way, abandonment is just that, it's not used at all. This doesn't mean somebody goes out there and they're sitting in it and they're using it in some capacity, but they may not be sleeping in it every night. I would say it's probably
Okay, so
not
it's not like it has to be
abandoned.
rented throughout.
Right. But if you think 6 months, you know, hey, we're only going to use it in the summer, so there could be a 6-month period, and you think it should be a year, or whatever period you think is appropriate, but I do suggest that you put at some point a line in the sand and saying, look, once if you stop using it for a certain period of time, you're going to come back and we'll have to evaluate it.
Right, no, I understand, I think the concept of abandonment is fine, it's just that seemed short to me, especially because if you are talking snowbirds, or, I don't know, just, it seems like people could be gone that amount of time not using it, and that's not the intent to have it.
What would you suggest, time-wise?
I mean, a year seems fine, at least 10 months, but a year seems logical.
I don't have a problem with that.
Okay.
Anybody else?
Yep, I concur.
Here's fine.
12 sounds better.
That'd be fine.
Okay,
Okay. So then let's go just
to the next one.
to the next phrase. So we said 6 months originally, 6 consecutive months, or a total of 18 months during any 3-year period. So the idea is you couldn't say, I'm going to show up for 1 day and then leave just so I don't abandon it. The idea was you have to have some minimum period of use. Do you want that concept in or not? And if so, is 18 months appropriate? Should we, you know, during a 3-year period, or would you like to change that as well?
I wonder if it's redundant, if you already have 12 months. I don't know if we need it.
Well, in the snowbird example, there could be 18 months of non-use in 3
3
years
sixes.
if
Technically.
they're only here for, you know, 3 or 4 months of the year.
Right.
So, you know, I would want to increase that number if we're gonna do a cumulative at all. You know, it should probably be,
Make it 2 years.
24 months during a 3-year period.
Okay.
I have a question on, for regular dwellings in the village, is there an abandonment clause?
Not on dwellings, for the most part, because those aren't special uses. A U.S. of right could, you know, but I'll look for a second. Give me a second, I can tell you where else it appears in the code.
Yeah, and I can,
'Cause
then if
this-
you go to 10.8, 2, you'll find it there. So a bit of context that might help this make sense. So ordinarily, abandonment is 30 days. We want that to be relatively aggressive because, you know, the classic example is, let's say you have a heavy industrial use that's been grandfathered over time. You want things like that to terminate, use it or lose it. This is intended to be more generous than that provision. It was originally written, you'll remember, when this wasn't a special use, right? Just anticipating that there would be non-conforming ADUs, and so you would provide a more generous cushion so people wouldn't lose that status. I will say, you know, the termination of a special use in a dwelling here, I mean, if that were to actually happen, that would be a pretty, I would say, I guess, goofy and unfortunate circumstance. On the other hand, there are other residential special uses in the village that are subject to that 30-day rule. When you look at lifts to the beach, underground garages, the one pool house in town, I mean, those are all subject to a stricter set of rules that hasn't come into issue before.
So a pool house has 30 days if it's not being used. they lose their special use.
Right.
I feel like,
You have to use your pool house.
right, I mean, that sounds pretty chilly in January to.
Yeah.
So that
Can I
is,
ask-
that is in fact, there is a 30-day termination on a pool house. I'm just curious.
Maybe it's in season.
Just
Yeah.
probably an artifact, maybe not even a conscious artifact of how it was implemented.
Okay.
I think
Can I ask a question here, Jill, but you can't see me? I'm just curious, though, that if you're gonna spend all this money, most likely 150,000, I would think, just to even do an accessory, and it's your right, it's your ownership, why, and if you can have someone live there, or they may not be there yet, who's going to monitor that? Do they get a sticker on their door warning them? I mean, are we really going to police this in a way that I just find that we're having this conversation over termination? And, I just really want to talk about sort of the articles and so many rules that are in place that, yes, we need the regulations, but I thought we were also going to try to simplify a lot of things in order for this to move forward. Not simplifying about not to exceed 1,000 square feet, things that really matter. But I guess I'm questioning, does this really matter? And how are we going to enforce this? And shouldn't somebody who owns this and pays money and owns that property have a right to whether they are in there or not? Anybody, family, whoever resides in the ADU building.
Good point.
Yep.
So if I may, if I can respond.
Certainly.
So legally, I guess there's two separate issues here. One is it may not cost somebody very much money at all to use something as an accessory dwelling structure. Certainly, when we think of having a nice place in the back for grandma, if it's my grandmother, I'm going to make sure that it's really nice, and I may want to spend a lot. But some people also may say, "Oh, my kid's coming home from college, and let's put him in the back, and so we can, I'm a contractor in my spare time, and with $2,000-3,000 can put in a functional toilet and try to make this a place to live." But the other thing, and I think it's a question of if you are a neighbor and somebody hasn't used the room above the garage or that accessory dwelling unit in years, and you've never known it to be used, if you don't have an abandonment provision, somebody could say, "Oh yeah, so I got a special use 15 years ago for this. Now my situation has changed. We're going to start using the accessory dwelling unit again." I think that's what partly the abandonment's meant to address. That at some point, we're going to reevaluate whether or not that should be allowed because conditions may have changed. And the conditions that exist today may not be the same in 15 years. So this is a policy decision of what you want, but that is the purpose. Now, in terms of how do we enforce it, we have similar provisions in the code, and oftentimes it happens in a couple ways. Either somebody applies for a building permit, and we say, "Wait a minute, let's evaluate this." The second is a complaint, which is the most common, where somebody, a neighbor or somebody nearby says they're not in conformance. For example, in your code right now, you have looking at abandonment, you have one provision on wireless service antennas and so forth that if you don't use for 12 months, then your special use is abandoned. And then somebody would have to come back and say, "I want to rehang a new antenna where one was before." But the idea is that at some point we draw a line in the sand. There are other provisions. Building permits is another example, 6 months on a building permit that you have, and if you don't start and use it within 6 months, the building permit is gone and then you have to reapply. So that's the concept.
I guess this probably is a bit moot because at least in my mind, I see the special use being dropped after we kind of have a trying out period, and assuming everything goes as planned, it will then be by right. So, you know, if in fact the abandonment is generally for special uses, then we may no longer be in special use territory and need something like that.
I'd be a little reluctant to totally delete that language. I think maybe a modification, as Deb indicated, on the duration, but I think, as Ben indicated, there are some good sound legal reasons why we might want to have that sort of language in here, especially if the abandoned property is not properly maintained. And that would have an adverse impact on the neighbors.
And we do have provisions in our code to deal with property maintenance. So if it was abandoned in the sense of it was truly not being maintained and became a nuisance, we do have some remedies to address that.
Can I talk to you about that later?
Yeah, I think, I appreciate Member Danley's point, certainly. But I think in this case, I fall on the side of having this clause in here to the point of, you know, a neighbor who has been there for a while, and then suddenly the neighbor wants to fire up their ADU, and it's gonna change maybe lighting and traffic pattern and, you know, sound, noise. It may be minor, but this at least addresses it and leaves some place for a neighbor to come and have a conversation.
And they could just come back and reapply.
Absolutely, right.
I mean, no reason why they couldn't. It's already built and everything, so they could just. I think I was just reacting to the time frame in here. I wasn't necessarily even thinking through, should that be in there in the first place? I understand Jill's comments, but I think it's okay to leave it in just to lengthen those times.
A year seems like an awful long period of time, at least from my perspective.
The other, if this helps, the other provision in our typical code with a special use permit is that no special use permit granted pursuant to the subsection shall be valid for a period longer than 1 year unless a building permit is issued and the construction for which the special use is granted is actually begun within that period and thereafter diligently pursued to completion, or a certificate of occupancy is issued and the use authorized by the special use permit is commenced within that period. So that's another place where we have some concept of abandonment. That's a little different. That doesn't talk about you giving up and stop using, but the idea is you get the special use, you have to act on it within a period of time, otherwise the approval is gone and you come back.
Well, should we split the difference? 9 months?
I was gonna say 9 months, split it.
I think I
That's fine.
would be fine with that for the snowbird example,
Yeah.
you know.
And
Right.
keep the abandonment clause,
And keep it.
yeah.
And then for, so that second part there, so 6 months or 18 during any three, should we understand that we'll do 9 or 27 in any three, just proportionally?
27 seems like, at least from my perspective, that's a very significant period of time. I'd prefer we'd stay with 18, unless there were extenuating circumstances, but,
Yeah, it's not proper, the math isn't quite working out if we do that, but I think the 18 out of 36 does make more sense for the cumulative time, oddly.
evenly, actually.
Technically.
Any further discussion on subparagraph K? Are we aligned on 9 months instead of 6 months and allowing for the 18 months to remain as currently drafted?
Acceptable to me.
Yep, that's fine.
Yep.
All right, thank you. Any other proposed comments or proposed revisions?
I do have one other question. I was just pondering, we have a number of areas in the village that were authorized as planned residential developments. Say, for instance, the sanctuary, which is the only R6 zoning district in the code. If the enabling documents for the sanctuary would specifically not allow accessory dwelling units, I don't know all the language and all the different enabling ordinances for the half dozen or so planned residential development areas that we have. Will that have to be reviewed on a case-by-case basis as the first sample project would come forward?
That's correct. So there's, the examples would be Tangley Oaks, Armor Woods. There's even a smaller one nested inside of Armor Woods. I think that's Oak Ridge, something like that.
Correct, yeah.
Belforet, Wimbledon, Bath and Tennis. Really, R6 is essentially a planned residential development on its own. So there's a number of those, and they all have their quirks when it comes to building permits. We're used to comparing those approvals when those requests come in.
Okay, so that's what I thought. We would have to, for anything happening in any of those planned residential developments, there's also the second check to make sure that they're even allowed within those development areas,
Correct,
regardless of what we're doing here.
correct.
And as I think as part of the special use process, if somebody came forward and wanted to do that, we would say, okay, we can grant you a special use, but we would also need to amend those enabling ordinances, which would be a whole other issue. And I'm not familiar enough with them to say how big of a deal it would be, what's entailed to do it, but we wouldn't be overriding those. So there's a way to do it
Right.
if somebody really wanted to, but that we would have the discretion on how to do it.
Okay, thanks.
So is this ready for prime time? With the noted changes?
I think so.
Guess it depends on the consensus of the commission. Obviously, we trust the drafting skills of Ben and his team, so, Glenn, what do you think?
From staff's perspective, we're comfortable with proceeding.
It was interesting, one of those articles that you sent us this week. Was it Evanston they voted it down, or which one was it, that Oak Park?
Oak Park, I think.
Yeah, so there's been a couple interesting developments. So one, Evanston has had first coach house regulations, then ADU regulations, then more liberal ADU regulations. They were on the cusp of enacting a moratorium driven by concerns near the university that essentially that ADUs would be built in the near future to act as student housing. They voted that down in part because there was no evidence that was actually happening. There were no permits, there were no requests at that time. That fits into a different narrative of university town gown issues, I would say. But again, for Evanston, for being very progressive in these things, looking at making a U-turn is interesting. Oak Park has a neighbor, River Forest, that adopted these beforehand, and they're at the end of their look at adoption. But as you saw, there's some controversy about attached units that I think is driven by tax assessment issues out there.
Okay, that's definitely different from our situation. It's not anything similar. Okay.
Right.
And does this draft have to go before the village board, generally before it goes to public hearing?
Either I or the village administrator plan to present that, so we've done that once before, we'll do it again. Procedurally, there's no such requirement, but we've said that when it would go to a hearing, that we would provide an update to the board, and I expect that'll happen either at the board's late October or early November.
I think that's an excellent idea.
And remember, when it does come to a hearing, if there's other little nits or issues or even major things that come up, either because you notice them or because a member of the public brings something up and you go, that's a good idea, you are certainly free to make the change. Now, if it's something that's minor, you know, like just like we did tonight, you know, I don't think 6 months is right. I think, you know, let's change the words. You know, you can do that on the fly. That's not a problem. And if it's something that's more substantive and you want to rewrite of whole sections or whatnot, you want us to come back, we would just continue the hearing. And then at the next subsequent meeting, we would present you another draft, just as we do with other amendments. So that's no problem.
Any dissent from progressing to a public hearing at the November meeting? Are we in consensus on that?
Yes.
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 All right, thank you. And it might be a multi-day public hearing, we just can't predict. At least we'll get the process started.
Glenn, from a field that you get in the village, you think this is going to be a controversial topic?
It's hard to say. I mean, I know there's been some interest in it. I still, even last week, I had a call from someone that's looking at these as an option to figure out their
I'm
personal
saying
circumstances.
any negative that you've come across about, because, I mean, it's out there sort of that we're doing this.
Yeah, I think you never know
signs yet.
quite how these issues will galvanize until it's at a hearing and people take that as the signal to be involved. Certainly, I've talked to a couple people that may be opposed to it,
Oh, really?
just over the last span of time. I mean,
Interesting. Okay.
but that was also the proposals have changed a lot over that span of time too. So hard to predict.
Okay.
All right, agenda item number 5, staff report.
Certainly. So we have a brief staff report this evening, but just wanted to really bring the group up to speed, perhaps, if the technology will cooperate, just on what's coming down the pipe for the foreseeable future. This is the first. Give me just one moment here, because I think I need to,
I'm good.
man. It's the first time I've had this one happen to me, goodness.
I cannot provide any technical support.
Oh, it's very unfortunate. I was counting on you, Chair Peters.
Just wanted to clarify it up front.
Not part of your job description.
Nope.
Let's try this again. Perfect. Sorry for the delay. So, again, a bit of thinking on where do we go from here, and these timelines are very generous. They assume that things maybe can take some time, move slow. By no means is this a recommendation that anything in here take a particular length of time. But going down the list, we know that we'll start hearings on, accessory dwelling units adopting these regulations in November. Perhaps you'll do them in one meeting, perhaps you'll do them in 2 meetings. From time to time, this group has taken off in December, so we wanted to preserve that option for you too. But we think at the longest, reasonably, you're talking about finishing that by January, if not perhaps sooner. Something else we've been working on internally with the village attorney's office and staff for some time is really some administrative cleanup work in the code. The code as it exists today really dates back and was last rewritten, got a deep touch in the early 80s, I believe it was readopted. It shows its age, as some of you have probably noticed looking through that document. Again, it works, mechanically it works, but there's a lot of usability issues, separating things out into their own sections, not having, a reference 10-2-4 subsection B2F24. There are things like that in our code that are very unwieldy. So what we've done is really go through and try to implement a lot of cleanup to 3 of the biggest administrative chapters of the code. Most of this is not substantive. There's a couple substantive parts we'll call out. The biggest part was driven by some changes to site plan recommended by the Architectural Board of Review. But what we're hoping to do is to distribute that draft and give you an overview in November, and then take some time, probably it will take 3 months in December and January to really look at this, wrap yourselves all the way around it, and consider making a recommendation. What I would say is, again, our goal is just to get some cleanup without changing a whole lot of how this works. If there is a desire to change how this works, that will be a longer process, and for the reasons we'll discuss, that's probably a process you'd want to defer for a later time. We know for sure in probably about January, we'll have the PRD amendments that Michael Blue and Teska have been working on. Those should be ready for your review and consideration. So you'll have hearings on that. And then really what I would say has shown itself recently is on and off, really for, if we're being frank, 10 years or so, the village has worked on updates, refreshes, a revised comprehensive plan. The last one was adopted in '97. We're coming up on 25 years pretty quickly. It will be 25 years before we adopt a new one, even if we move quickly. We're not starting from scratch. There was a lot of work done in 2017, 2018, and a bit into 2019 as well that we're picking up. You recall this ADU discussion came out of that. But what we'd really like to do is try to pick up where we left off, get there's been some changes in membership to really get our new members up to speed on what those prior discussions look like, and see if we can bring this to a draft, have something ready for the board to consider in 2022. And to the extent that there are other issues out there, for example, you might notice that our outdoor storage discussion has been dropped from the agenda here. We're really looking as staff to defer those other issues and really try to get this planning piece done.
Okay.
So the longer part of that work plan will bring you some more details on in coming meetings. What I'm hoping to do, at least as an introduction, is we'll distribute out some of the work that was done already. And I think, it's hard to find solutions, but it's easy to identify problems. So if we'd all like to have a venting session, my thought is in December or January, we'll pass out, again, where we were at with the draft, and really we'll pass out a list of, here's what we've been listening to the last few years. Here's what we know are the problem areas. Let's call them what they are, problems, right? Or deficiencies, or places where we can do better in our planning and zoning practice. And we'll just see if there's consensus just about those list of things that should be looked at, so we can make sure that those are considered in that planning process to come. Again, that process, there'll be a lot of work here. There'll be a lot of drafting work. There'll be probably a more robust public engagement process than just public hearings. but it's important work and it's something we're hoping to focus on in '22. So happy to answer any questions.
Member Badger's question?
Yes, so there is no, no settlement with the Stonebridge folks. There's no application from Stonebridge. There's no applications or anything like that concerning Block 3. So we remain status quo.
Okay.
Okay.
If anything changes, again,
Well, let's
you'll
end
hear
up.
about it. Yes.
Yeah, with respect to the comp plan, when the time comes, Glenn, as you indicated, maybe we'll allocate a significant amount of time to one meeting just to give us that historical overview, because a lot of great work was done under the chairmanship of Steve Kraus. We did a lot of good work ourselves for about a year, and then I think I think COVID diverted us or something else did, but a lot of work's been done on it.
Good, great.
All right.
I will add one last thing. So, again, nothing on those topics we talked about. I'm expecting that final plan for Arden Shore, the Kriebel development, I expect you'll see that at your next meeting in November.
Great.
And something I would consider too, that we'll talk about more as we come up on this, depending on what other applications are out there, as we get into '22, a lot of this is the pace you desire as a group to work at. There will probably be enough, at least in some months, where you should consider either a second meeting or an earlier start, and we don't have to make those decisions now, but I would think about what your preferences are and we'll accommodate them.
Great, thank you, Mr. Cole. Agenda item number 6, Commissioners' Report. Hearing none. Agenda item number 7, adjournment. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Hi.
All right,
Bye.
great, thank you.